A scored brake line does not fail immediately. It weeps, one microscopic drop at a time, invisible to anyone who is not lying on their back beneath the vehicle with a flashlight and 42 years of inspecting metal under stress. The fluid seeps through the score mark, the way water seeps through a hairline crack in a dam, so slowly that the driver never notices the pedal growing softer until the morning they press their foot down on a 12% grade and discover that the space between the pedal and the floor has become a canyon. I went to Annie's apartment at 2 a.m. She lived in a small complex on the south side of Cheyenne, the kind of place where the parking lot was poorly lit, and the security cameras had been broken long enough that no one expected them to work. I lay down on the frozen asphalt and slid beneath the Subaru with a flashlight clamped between my teeth and a feeling in my chest that I can only describe as the sensation of confirming something you have been praying is not true. The brake line ran along the undercarriage in a standard configuration, steel tube carrying hydraulic fluid from the master cylinder to the calipers. I followed it with the beam, inch by inch, the way I used to follow a signal wire along a rail bed. I found it on the passenger side, 6 inches before the junction that fed the front calipers. A score mark, not a cut, a deliberate, precise abrasion approximately 2 inches long, made with the tool that left a groove exactly deep enough to compromise the wall thickness without breaking through. The metal around the score was clean. No oxidation, no road grime. Someone had drawn a line across the brake tube with the calm hand of a man who understood exactly how much metal needed to remain for the line to hold under normal braking but fail under the sustained pressure of a long downhill grade. I pressed my thumb against the score and felt the faintest dampness. The weep had begun. A few more days of driving, a few more cycles of pressure, and the wall would fatigue. The failure would come without warning, probably on a cold morning when the metal was brittle, on a stretch where the driver needed the brakes most. Dead Man's Curve, 19.4 miles from this parking lot, exactly the distance a scored line of this depth would survive before it gave way. I slid out and sat on the frozen asphalt with my back against the tire. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, from the knowledge that I had just touched the instrument of my daughter's planned murder, and that the man who scored that line had done it with the same hands that held Annie's face when he kissed her good night. I called Dale from the parking lot. He answered on the first ring. I found it. I said, passenger side, scored, not cut. 4 or 5 days from failure. Dale was quiet for 3 seconds. The shop in Rollins. I ran the registration. It is owned by Tyler Lassiter. Lassiter. Roy Lassiter's nephew. Dale continued. 28. Certified mechanic. 2 priors for insurance fraud. Both pled down. He is not a friend doing a favor. Howard. He is a subcontractor in a network that includes his uncle at the land office, Elena Voss at the insurance company, and your son-in-law at the center of it all. This is not one man with a bad habit. This is an operation with departments. I asked what else he had found. Nate had been mapping Annie's commute for at least 3 weeks, using a GPS tracker mounted under her dashboard. The data showed her route, her speed, her timing, every morning, 6:45, She passed Dead Man's Curve at the bottom of the grade, braking hard for the switchback, generating exactly the sustained pressure that would blow a scored line open. "And there is one more thing," Dale said. His voice dropped into the register I remembered from the morning he told me about the tanker derailment in Rawlins that killed 2 engineers. "He has been looking into you, Howard, your medical records, your routine, your house. In his files, you are listed as a secondary liability. He has a note next to your name, Resolve, before spring." I was still on the asphalt, processing what Resolve before spring meant for a man who had already resolved one wife with a scored brake line and a mountain curve, when headlights swept across the parking lot. Not the Subaru, another car. The door opened, and Annie stepped out into the cold, her coat thrown over pajamas, her face swollen from crying. "Dad." She was looking at my truck at the far end. "Dad, are you here?" I stood and brushed the ice from my coat. She ran to me and pressed her face against my chest the way she had when she was 7 and afraid of thunderstorms. "Nate says if I do not sign by Friday, Clyde will die." Her voice broke on the last word. "He says I am the only one who can save him. What do I do?" I held my daughter in a parking lot at 2:30 in the morning, her tears soaking through my coat, the scored brake line 3 feet beneath us humming its silent countdown. The time for inspection was over. The signal was no longer flickering. It was solid red. And if I did not pull the emergency brake now, the train was going to reach the curve, and there would be nothing left to save. I was born a Whitmore. I could have married a fortune and lived my whole life on a hill above the town. Instead, I gave up every dollar of it for a poor mechanic named Thomas Hale, and over 37 years I built that man into the most beloved mayor this town has ever known. So when he stood before 200 people at his retirement gala and thanked every soul who ever mattered to him, I waited for my name. He never said it. That night, I took down a cedar box I had hidden for 37 years, and I decided the woman who built a king was finally going to write his ending. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning of that evening, before I knew what was coming, when I still believed my name would be spoken aloud. The community hall in Harrow's Bend had never looked finer. There were 200 guests that night, every chair filled, the long tables draped in white linen that caught the candle light and held it. Someone had arranged white roses in low glass bowls down the center of each table, and the autumn air outside was crisp enough that the windows had begun to fog at the edges. It was the kind of evening I had spent a lifetime making possible for other people. And now, here it was, made for my husband, and I sat at the very far end of the room, in the corner, where the light did not quite reach. I should tell you that I noticed where they had placed me. A woman learns to notice these things. The seat of honor, the chair beside the lectern, that should have been mine, had been given to Claire. The mayor's secretary, a pleasant young woman who had worked for Thomas for the last 6 years. I am sure no one meant anything cruel by it. That is the thing about being slowly erased. It is rarely cruel. It is only a series of small arrangements, each one reasonable on its own, that add up over the years to a woman sitting alone in a corner at her own husband's celebration. I looked down at the program resting beside my untouched plate. It was a lovely thing, printed on heavy cream paper, listing the order of the evening and the names of those who would speak. I read it once, and then I read it again, more slowly, because the first time I had not quite believed what I was seeing. My name was nowhere on it, not as a speaker, not even in the small line of thanks at the bottom where they had listed the committee, the caterers, the man who had loaned the sound system. 37 years, and I was not worth a single line of cream-colored paper. I folded my hands in my lap, and I sat very still, the way I had taught myself to sit still through 1,000 disappointments. And I told myself it did not matter. I told myself that the program was a small thing, that what mattered was the moment Thomas would rise to speak and find me in the crowd and say the words I had waited the better part of my life to hear. Because I had earned those words. Let me be clear about that here at the beginning, so you understand everything that follows. I did not stand quietly behind a great man. I made the great man. I wrote the speeches that won him his first seat. I called in favors from a family that had cast me out. I built the careful machine of his career so smoothly that even he had come to believe he had built it himself. I had given up a name that opened every door in that valley, and a fortune that would have kept me in comfort for the rest of my days. And I had given them up gladly, because once, long ago, a young man with grease on his hands had looked at me as though I were a person instead of a prize. So I watched him now. He looked magnificent. I will give him that. At 67, Thomas Hale still had all his silver hair and that easy way of standing that made a room lean toward him. He wore a charcoal suit I had chosen and a tie I had straightened that very morning. And when Howard, the bank manager who was serving as master of ceremonies, called his name, the entire hall rose to its feet. The applause went on for a long time. I rose too, of course. I clapped until my hands ached, and I smiled, because that is what a wife does, and because some stubborn, hopeful part of me was still certain that any moment now he would look across that sea of faces and find mine. Thomas stepped up to the lectern and raised both hands to quiet the room, and the room obeyed, the way it always did. He smiled that warm, practiced smile, the one I had watched him learn, the one I had helped him perfect, and he leaned toward the microphone. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you all. Before I say anything else tonight, I want to take a moment to thank the people who made all of this possible, the people who mattered, the people who mattered." My heart lifted so high in my chest that it almost hurt. This was the moment, after 37 years of writing his words. I was finally about to hear my own name in his mouth, spoken with the whole town watching. He reached into his breast pocket, unfolded a small piece of paper, and began to read. He began with Claire, the secretary. He called her his right hand, the woman without whom the office would have fallen apart years ago. He thanked her for her loyalty, her tireless hours, her steady presence through 3 terms. Claire blushed and pressed a hand to her chest, and the room murmured its warm approval. I watched her from my seat near the kitchen doors, and I felt nothing toward her, that poor young woman who had no idea she was sitting in a chair that should have been mine. She was not the one who had decided where I would sit. She was only the one who had been chosen to fill the space. Then he thanked his campaign donors each by name. He thanked the Hendersons, who owned the lumber yard, and old Mr. Caldwell, who had funded his very first run for council. He thanked his golf partners. He thanked the men he played cards with on Thursday nights, the men whose wives I had hosted in my dining room more times than I could count, women who had eaten the food I prepared and admired the home I kept, and never once asked what I had given up to keep it. I waited. I told myself there was an order to these things. You saved the most important person for last. Everyone knew that. You built toward the one who mattered most, and you let the whole room feel the weight of it before you spoke the name. So I sat with my hands flat against the linen, and I waited for him to arrive at me, the way a traveler waits at a station for a train she has been promised will come. He thanked his mother, who had passed 12 years earlier. He thanked the memory of his father, a quiet man who had fixed engines for a living and never understood how his son had climbed so high. And then Thomas paused, and his voice softened, and he looked toward the front table, the table of honor, where Claire sat glowing in my chair. And he said that he could not let this night pass without acknowledging the young people of Harrow's Bend, the next generation, the future of this town that he had given his life to serve. And he kept going. He thanked the high school. He thanked the new families who had moved in over the past decade. He thanked, God help me, the regional newspaper for its fair coverage over the years. It was somewhere around that moment, sitting at the end of table 11 with a cup of coffee growing cold in front of me, that I understood. It was not an oversight. There had been no mistake with the seating cards. My name was not coming. He had stood before 200 people, before the entire town we had built together, and he had thanked the newspaper before he had thanked his wife, and he was not going to correct it. He was not going to turn. There would be no moment. There had never been going to be a moment. I have tried many times since to describe what happened inside me then. It was not an explosion. People always expect an explosion, a shattered glass, a raised voice, a scene the town would whisper about for years. There was none of that. What I felt was closer to the sound a door makes when it closes in an empty house. A soft, final click, somewhere deep in my chest, and then silence. A silence so complete it almost felt like peace. I thought about the 37 years. I thought about the night I had walked out of my father's house with one suitcase and a wooden box, believing love would be enough to build a life on. I thought about every speech I had written in the dark while this man slept. I thought about the fortune I had turned my back on, the name I had set down like a stone too heavy to carry, all so that Thomas Hale could stand on a stage one autumn evening and forget that I existed. I did not cry. I want you to know that. Whatever else I lost that night, I did not give them my tears. Thomas finished his speech to a standing ovation. The whole room rose, 200 people on their feet, their applause filling that hall like floodwater. I rose too, because to remain seated would have been a scene, and I had promised myself, long ago, that I would never be a scene. I stood, and I clapped, and I smiled the smile I had worn for 4 decades, the one that fit my face better than my own skin. Then I picked up my coffee cup and my saucer, and I carried them myself to the gray plastic tub by the kitchen doors, where the dirty dishes were collected. I do not know why I did it. No one had asked me to. Perhaps it was the only useful thing left for me to do in that room. I set the cup down gently among the others, and I did not look back at the stage. I did not look back at my husband, basking in the warmth of a love he had not earned and could not keep. I walked out through the side door into the cold New England night, and the applause followed me out into the dark, growing fainter with every step, until at last I could not hear it at all. I drove home alone. The roads were empty, the trees black against a sky scattered with stars, and the whole way there, I thought of one thing only: a box of cedar wood that had sat untouched on the top shelf of my closet for 37 years. A box I had carried out of one life and into another, and never once opened. That night, for the first time since my wedding day, I took it down. Before I was the woman in the corner of the banquet hall, before I was anyone's wife or anyone's afterthought, I was a Whitmore, and in the town of Harrow's Bend, Vermont. That name meant something. The Whitmores had been in that valley for 4 generations. We owned the mill that had built half the town, the bank that held its mortgages, and a stone house on the hill that everyone called the estate, though no one in the family ever called it anything but home. My father, Charles Whitmore, ran all of it the way he ran everything, with a cold and unbending hand. He was a man who believed that the world was an account to be balanced, that every person had a value and a place, and that the great tragedy of life was disorder. He loved me, I think, in the way a man loves a well-kept ledger. I was an asset to be protected, and in time, to be invested wisely. I was raised to be ornamental and useful at once. I learned which fork to use and which families to flatter. I learned to play the piano well enough to perform, but never so well that I might be mistaken for someone with ambitions of her own. I learned to enter a room and read it in a single glance, to know in an instant who held power and who only pretended to. It was a useful education, though not in the way my father intended. The skills he gave me to make a good match were the very skills I would one day use to build a man into a mayor. But that was still far away. That summer I turned 27. The summer everything began. My father had already chosen a husband for me. His name was Gerald Pruitt, the son of a banking family 2 valleys over, a man with soft hands and a softer chin, who spoke to me only of his horses and his father's holdings. The arrangement was not yet announced, but it was understood, the way the weather is understood before the storm arrives. I was to marry Gerald, merge two fortunes, and continue the long, orderly march of the Whitmore name into another generation. I did not love him. I was not expected to love in my father's ledger, was not a column that needed balancing. And then the car broke down. It was a hot afternoon in July, and I was driving back from town when the engine of my father's automobile gave a great cough and died on the road just past the old garage at the edge of Harrow's Bend. I had never so much as lifted the hood of a car in my life. I stood there in my good dress, helpless in a way that infuriated me, until a young man in oil-stained coveralls walked out of the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. His name was Thomas Hale. He did not bow. He did not call me Miss Whitmore in that careful, deferential tone everyone in town used, the tone that put a wall between me and the rest of the living world. He looked at the car, and then he looked at me, and he asked me a simple question. He asked me what I had heard the engine do right before it stopped, as though I might know, as though my answer might matter. No one had ever asked me a question like that. No one had ever spoken to me as though I were a person with something worth saying, rather than a name with a fortune attached. I told him what I had heard, the cough, the shudder, and he nodded as if I had given him something useful, and he set to work. I stood and watched him in the heat, this young man with grease on his forearms and an easy confidence that owed nothing to money or family, and I felt something I had no name for. It was not yet love. It was simpler and more dangerous than that. It was the feeling of being seen. He fixed the car in 20 minutes. When I tried to pay him, he refused. He said it was nothing, a loose connection, the kind of thing that fixed itself once you knew where to look. Then he smiled at me, and I drove home with my heart doing something it had never done before. I told myself it was nothing, a pleasant stranger, a small kindness, a story I would forget by autumn. But I found reasons to drive past that garage. I found that the engine of my father's car developed a remarkable number of small problems that summer, each one requiring the attention of the young mechanic at the edge of town. And each time, he asked me questions and listened to my answers and treated me as though my thoughts were worth the trouble of hearing. My whole life I had been a Whitmore, a name, a holding, a piece on my father's board. And here was a man with nothing who saw a woman instead. I did not yet understand what that summer would cost me. I did not know that the man who taught me what it felt like to be seen would one day be the man who taught a whole town to look right through me. If someone had warned me, standing on that hot road with the smell of motor oil in the air, I am not certain I would have listened. We rarely do when we are 27 and the world has finally, for the first time, asked us what we heard. I only knew that summer that I had begun, very quietly, to want a life I chose for myself. I fell in love with Thomas Hale the way you fall asleep, slowly, and then all at once. That summer turned to autumn, and the small problems with my father's car gave way to something I could no longer disguise as coincidence. We met in places where no one from the hill would think to look. A diner 2 towns over, a back road by the river where the maples burned red in October. We talked for hours, and it was the talking I fell in love with as much as anything. The way he asked me what I thought, and then actually waited for the answer. He told me about his life. His mother, who had died young, his father who drank, the way he had taught himself to fix engines because no one was going to teach him anything else. He had built himself out of nothing, and he had done it without bitterness. And I found that more impressive than any fortune my father had ever balanced. I knew it could not last. A Whitmore did not love a mechanic. The whole architecture of my life forbade it, and I had spent 27 years learning exactly how that architecture worked. But knowing a thing is impossible and being able to stop yourself from wanting it are 2 very different matters, as anyone who has ever loved past their good sense will tell you. My father found out in the first week of October. I never learned exactly how. Harrow's Bend was a small town, and small towns keep no secrets from the people who own them. I came down to breakfast one morning, and he was sitting at the head of the table with his hands folded. And I knew before he said a word that everything had changed. He did not shout. That was not his way. He laid it out for me the way he laid out everything, cold and clear, an account to be settled. He told me what he knew. He told me what it would cost the family if the engagement to Gerald Pruitt collapsed because the Whitmore girl had been seen with a man who smelled of motor oil. And then he gave me a choice, though he did not call it a choice. He called it the only sensible course. I would end it. I would marry Gerald in the spring. I would take my place in the order of things, and in time, I would be grateful that he had saved me from a foolish girl's mistake. And if I would not, then I was no longer a Whitmore. There would be no inheritance, no estate, no name. He would close the account entirely. I would walk out of that house with nothing but what I could carry. I want you to understand that I knew exactly what I was being asked to give up. I was not a romantic fool who did not understand the value of money. I had grown up surrounded by it. I knew the weight of it, the safety of it, the doors it opened and the doors it kept shut. I knew that to choose Thomas was to choose a life of small kitchens and tight budgets, and a town that would whisper behind its hands. I knew all of it, and I chose him anyway. I married Thomas Hale the spring I turned 28, in a small white church at the edge of town, with the minister's wife as our only witness. I wore a simple dress, not the gown that had been waiting for me in my mother's closet for the Pruitt wedding that would now never happen. My father did not come. My mother came to the door of my room the morning I left, and she did not say much, because she had spent her whole life learning not to. But she pressed something into my hands before I went. It was a wooden box made of cedar, small enough to hold in 2 palms, with my initials carved into the lid. She told me it had been her mother's and her grandmother's before that, and that a woman should always have one thing that belongs to her alone, that no one can take and no one can give. Then she kissed my forehead and went back inside, and I never lived in that house again. I walked out of the Whitmore estate with a single suitcase and that cedar box, and nothing else. No fortune, no name, as far as my father was concerned. I had given up a kingdom, and I did it with my chin up and my eyes dry, because I believed, with the whole stubborn certainty of a young woman in love, that I was walking towards something better. Thomas was waiting for me at the bottom of the hill in his old truck, and when he saw me coming with my one suitcase, he got out and ran to take it from my hands, and he looked at me as though I had given him the world. Perhaps, in a way, I had given him everything I owned, which was nothing, and everything I was, which was, I would learn much later, a great deal more than either of us understood at the time. We drove away from the hill together, and I did not look back. I told myself that names and money were only things, that a person was more than the account their father kept. I told myself that what we had was rarer than any fortune, and that it would carry us through whatever came. I was 28 years old, and I had just given away a kingdom for love. I believed love would be enough. Love is not enough, but it is a beginning. The first years of our marriage were lean, and I would be lying if I said I never missed the warmth of the house on the hill on a January morning. We rented half of a narrow place above the hardware store, and I learned to do 100 things I had never done in my life. I learned to stretch $1 until it cried out. I learned to cook from what was cheap that week. I learned that a Whitmore could scrub a floor as well as anyone, once she stopped expecting someone else to do it. And I was happy. That is the part people never quite believe, but it is true. Those small rooms held more genuine happiness than the estate ever had. But I had not been raised among powerful men for nothing. I had spent my whole girlhood watching how power was made, how it moved from hand to hand, how a word in the right ear could do what a fortune could not. And I began to see something in Thomas that he did not yet see in himself. People trusted him. It was a gift, and it was real. When Thomas spoke to a man about his troubles, that man felt heard in a way that few people ever feel. He remembered names. He remembered the small details of other people's lives, the sick mother, the daughter heading off to school. He had the rare ability to make every person in a room feel, for a moment, like the only person in it. He had built that gift out of a hard childhood, out of needing people to like him in order to survive. And he did not even know it was worth anything. I knew it was worth everything. So I went to work, quietly, the way I did everything, when the seat on the town council came open in our 4th year of marriage, the one left empty when old Mr. Abernathy finally retired. I was the one who saw the opening before anyone else. Thomas thought himself a mechanic with no business in politics. I told him otherwise. I sat at our small kitchen table late into the night, and I wrote his first speech, word by word, until it sounded like the best version of the man I had married. I taught him where to pause, where to let his voice drop, when to smile, and I made the calls. This is the part no one ever knew. I still had the Whitmore name in my blood, even if my father had cut me off. And in a town like Harrow's Bend, blood remembers. I wrote letters in my own careful hand to families who had done business with my father for generations. I did not ask them to support a Whitmore. I asked them to support a good man named Thomas Hale, and I let them draw the connection for themselves. I leveraged every thread of the network I had been born into, the very network my father thought he had taken from me when he closed his ledger. Thomas won the council seat comfortably. He came home that night and lifted me off my feet and said, "We did it. I remember the word. I held on to it for years." He served on that council and made himself useful and well-liked. And I kept writing, kept advising, kept building the careful architecture beneath him that no one could see. It took years more, patient years, before the chance at the mayor's office came. When it did, in our 11th year of marriage, I ran that campaign the way a general runs a war. From a tent no one ever entered. I knew which neighborhoods to court and which to let alone. I knew which promises would hold and which would break us. I wrote every word he spoke, and I watched him deliver them as though they had risen up from his own heart, and the town fell in love with the man I had made. Somewhere in those years, the word began to change. It was so gradual I almost missed it. "We did it" became, "I think the people just trust me." "We decided" became, "I felt it was the right thing." The plural slipped away one syllable at a time, and I told myself it was nothing, that a public man must speak of himself, that the work was ours even if the words were his. I told myself a great many things in those years. He won the mayor's office in a landslide. The night the results came in, the small headquarters I had built filled with people cheering his name, and Thomas stood in the middle of it glowing, and he found me at the edge of the room where I always stood, and he kissed me and said it again. We did it. For one more night. The word was still ours. But I was already in the shadows by then, and I did not yet understand that the shadow was where I would stay. I had taken a mechanic and built him into a king. I had used everything I knew, everything I was, every thread of a name my own father had tried to strip from me. And I had done it so well, so invisibly, that even the man I had made would one day come to believe he had made himself. That is the danger of building a king. If you do it well enough, the king forgets he was ever built. He comes to believe the crown grew from his own head. I did not see it yet. That warm victory night with his arm around me and the room shouting his name. But the crown was already settling, and there was no room beneath it for the woman who had forged it. There is one victory I have not told you about. I have left it for last, the way you leave the heaviest stone at the bottom of the bag, because it is the one that would matter most in the end. Though I did not know it then. It happened during the second campaign for mayor. the year Thomas faced a real opponent for the first time. The man's name was Walter Briggs, and he owned the hardware store on Main Street, and he was, by every honest measure, a decent man. He was not warm the way Thomas was warm. He did not have the gift, but he was careful, and he was fair, and he had noticed something that no one else in Harrow's Bend had thought to question. He had noticed that a great deal of state money had flowed into our town during Thomas's first term. Money for roads and for the new wing of the school, and that some of it had passed through the hands of a contracting firm owned by a cousin of one of Thomas's biggest donors. I knew about that arrangement. I want to be honest with you because I have spent a great many years being dishonest with myself, and I am too old now to keep doing it. I knew. I had seen the papers. I understood, better than Thomas did, exactly what had been done. The inflated invoices, the work that was billed for and never finished, the quiet kickback that found its way back to the campaign that had made it all possible. It was not a fortune. It was the kind of small, ordinary corruption that holds up half the politics in this country. The kind everyone suspects and no one proves. But it was enough. If Walter Briggs had found the proof he was reaching for, it would have ended Thomas. It would have ended everything I had spent years building. So I ended Walter Briggs instead. I did not do anything dramatic. I have never in my life done anything dramatic. I simply made certain that the documents he needed could not be found. I spoke to the cousin who owned the contracting firm, a nervous man who owed his livelihood to my husband's office, and I made him understand gently and completely what was at stake for all of us. I called in the last of the old Whitmore debts, the ones I had been saving, and I let it be known among the right people that Walter Briggs was a bitter man chasing shadows, a sore loser before he had even lost. By the time the election came, the rumor had eaten through his good name like rust through iron. He lost in a landslide. He closed the hardware store 2 years later and moved away, and I never saw him again. And I have thought of him more often in these recent months than I ever did in all the years between. What I could not do, in the end, was destroy the proof entirely. There was one set of documents, the originals, the ones that showed plainly what had been done and who had done it, and some careful instinct in me would not let me burn them. Perhaps I told myself it was insurance. Perhaps even then, some part of me that I did not want to listen to understood that a woman who builds a king ought to keep one card she can play if the king ever turns on her. I did not believe he would. I loved him, but I kept the papers all the same. I put them in the cedar box. It was the only place I knew he would never look. He thought the box was empty. I had let him think so for years. It was a sentimental old thing, my one keepsake from a family that had cast me out, and Thomas had no patience for sentiment that did not serve him. He never opened it. He never once, in 37 years, lifted that lid. So I folded the originals carefully, and I laid them in the bottom of the box beneath a few worthless mementos, a dried flower, a faded photograph, a ribbon. And I closed the lid, and I placed it on the high shelf in my closet where it had sat ever since. And then I did something I have never forgiven myself for. I helped him win. I stood beside him on the night of that second victory, and I smiled at the people of Harrow's Bend, and I let them believe their mayor was an honest man, when I held the proof that he was not in a box in my closet. I told myself I had done it for love. I told myself that everyone's hands are a little dirty, that this was simply how the world worked, that Walter Briggs would have done the same in Thomas's place. I told myself a great many things, and I believed almost none of them, and I went on smiling for another 3 decades. I am not telling you this to excuse what came later. I am telling you because you deserve to know that I was not innocent. The woman they forgot at the end of Table 11 was not some helpless creature who never raised her voice. I was capable of a great deal when I chose to be. I had ended a good man's career to protect a man who would one day forget my name. That is the kind of thing love can make you do. When you have poured so much of yourself into another person that you can no longer tell where they end and you begin. The box sat on that shelf for 37 years, gathering dust, holding its silence. I almost forgot what was inside it. Almost. But it was still there, waiting. The night I finally took it down, a dried flower, a faded photograph, a ribbon, and beneath them, folded and yellowed and patient, the secret that would one day decide everything. People imagine that a woman disappears all at once. They picture a single cruel act, a slammed door, a betrayal sharp enough to cut a life cleanly in two. But that is not how it happens. At least it was not how it happened to me. Disappearing happens slowly. It happens one forgotten thank you at a time, so gradually that you do not notice you are vanishing until the day you look in the mirror and find you can barely see yourself at all. In the early years, Thomas still introduced me. "This is my wife, Eleanor," he would say, and there would be warmth in it and pride. Somewhere in the middle years, that changed without my noticing. The introductions grew shorter. "This is Eleanor." And then, shorter still. A hand waved vaguely in my direction at some function. My wife, as though my name had become a detail too small to bother with. I did not protest. What was there to protest? A man cannot be scolded for the length of an introduction. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself it meant nothing. I had become very skilled over the years at telling myself that things meant nothing. I went on doing the work all the same. That was the strange part, the part I find hardest to explain even now. The more invisible I became, the harder I worked to deserve the recognition I was no longer receiving. I wrote every speech he gave for 3 terms as mayor. I drafted his position on the mill closures, the careful words that kept the town from turning on him when 400 people lost their work. I remembered the names of every constituent's child and ailing mother, and I fed those names to him before town meetings so that he could greet people with a warmth that seemed to them like genuine care. They loved him for the things I gave him. I told myself their love was a kind of love for me too, passed through him the way light passes through a window. I see now that a window receives no warmth. It only lets the warmth pass on to the room beyond. I kept the books. I managed the household on a public servant's modest salary and made it look effortless. I hosted the dinners that mattered, the ones where deals were made over my roast chicken and my good wine, and I steered conversations toward the conclusions Thomas needed. And afterward, when the guests praised him for his vision, he accepted the praise as though the evening had been his doing. I planned the strategy for every campaign. There was an election, years in, that we very nearly lost. And it was I who saw the danger coming, and I who turned it, working the telephone for 3 solid weeks, while Thomas slept the easy sleep of a man who has never once lain awake wondering if everything might fall apart. And in return, I was thanked less and less, until one year I was not thanked at all. I remember the exact moment I understood what I had become, though I buried the understanding almost as soon as it arrived, because I was not yet ready to look at it. It was at a dinner party in our own home. We had perhaps a dozen guests, the usual mix of donors and officials and their wives. One of the wives, a sharp woman named Diane, whose husband sat on the county board, turned to me over dessert and asked, with the bright cruelty that passes for friendliness in such circles, "And what is it that you do, Eleanor, all day in this big house, now that there are no children underfoot?" The table went quiet for just a moment, the way a table does when everyone has heard a question they are glad they did not have to ask. And before I could answer, before I could find the words for the speeches and the strategies, and the 30 years of invisible labor that had built the very career we were all there to celebrate, Thomas laughed. He laughed, and he reached over and patted my hand the way you pat a faithful old dog, and he said, "Oh, Eleanor keeps the home fires burning. Don't you, dear?" And everyone laughed with him, relieved. And the conversation moved on, and I sat there with my husband's hand on mine and a smile fixed on my face, and I felt something inside me go very still and very cold. He did not know what he had done. That was the worst of it. There was no malice in it. He genuinely believed it. Somewhere over those long years, Thomas had rewritten the history of his own life so completely that he no longer remembered I had been in it. The speeches had become his speeches. The strategy had become his instinct. The town had become his town, won by his charm, governed by his judgment. I had become the woman who kept the home fires burning. And the most frightening thing of all was how easy it had been. How a person can be erased not with hatred, but with simple, comfortable forgetting by a man who would have told you, if you asked him, that he loved his wife. I cleared the dessert plates myself that night, after the guests had gone. Thomas had already gone up to bed, pleased with how the evening had gone, certain it had been a triumph. I stood at the kitchen sink in the quiet house, washing the good china by hand because I did not trust the machine with it. And I looked out the dark window at my own faint reflection, and for the first time in many years I tried to remember the girl who used to walk into a room and turn it. I could not find her, and there was someone else in that house I was losing to, someone I had not yet let myself worry about. My son, my Daniel. He was born on a February night, the kind of night when the snow comes down so thick it erases the road. Thomas was 3 towns over at a county meeting, and the telephone lines were down. So I made the drive to the hospital alone, my hands steady on the wheel even as everything inside me trembled. We had been married 7 years by then, 7 years of building a life out of almost nothing, and I had wanted a child for so long that when the nurse finally placed him in my arms, I wept the way you weep when something you have prayed for stops being a prayer and becomes a weight against your chest. I named him Daniel. Thomas arrived the next morning, snow still melting on his shoulders, and he looked at his son with a kind of wonder I had not seen in him before. For one moment, we were simply 2 people who had made something good together. I want you to understand that the early years were not unhappy. I taught Daniel to read in the kitchen, tracing the letters with his small finger across the page. I taught him to be kind, to hold doors, to look people in the eye, to say thank you and mean it. I taught him that a person's worth has nothing to do with where they were born or what their name carried. I taught him all the things I believed, the things I had given up a fortune to live by. And he was a sweet boy. He brought me dandelions from the yard as though they were roses. He fell asleep against my shoulder during long car rides. He once told me, at 6 years old, that when he grew up, he wanted to be exactly like me. But a boy watches who the world applauds, and the world applauded his father. By the time Daniel was old enough to understand what a mayor was, Thomas had become one. The boy saw the handshakes, the ribbon cuttings, the way a room shifted when his father walked into it. He saw men twice his age lean in to hear what Thomas had to say. And what did he see of me? He saw a woman in the kitchen. He saw a woman ironing shirts and remembering birthdays and standing quietly at the edge of photographs. He did not see the speeches I wrote at midnight, the phone calls I made, the careful, invisible architecture I built beneath his father's career. How could he? I had hidden it on purpose. I had made Thomas's success look effortless, and in doing so, I had made my own labor disappear. Thomas did not help. As Daniel grew, his father began to tell the story of our lives in a particular way, a way that placed himself at the center of every good thing and left me at the margins. He would say, "I built this town up from nothing," and Daniel would nod. He would say, "Your mother has always been content to keep things simple." And Daniel would believe him. It was never a single cruel sentence. It was 1,000 small revisions, repeated so often that they hardened into fact in a young man's mind. And so Daniel grew into a man who loved his father and tolerated his mother. By the time he was 30, working at a firm in the city and home only for holidays, the distance between us had become a settled thing, comfortable to him and quietly devastating to me. He was unfailingly polite. That was almost the worst part. There was no cruelty I could point to, no slammed door, no shouted word. There was only the gentle condescension of a son who had decided long ago that his mother was a minor character in the story of his family. I remember the last Thanksgiving before the banquet. I had cooked for 2 days. Daniel sat at the table and talked with his father about politics, about the state of the town, about plans and futures, and when I mentioned carefully that I had once helped draft the very ordinance they were discussing, he smiled at me. It was a kind smile. It was the smile you give a child who has said something charming and slightly untrue. "Sure, Mom," he said. I'm sure you helped a lot. 3 small words that closed a door I had not even known was still open. He did not believe me. Worse, he did not think it mattered whether he believed me. In his mind, I was the woman who kept the home, and that was a fine thing for a woman to be, and there was no need to examine it any further. I cleared the plates that night, as I always did, and I stood at the sink with the water running hot over my hands, and I thought about all the years I had poured into raising a man who could look at me and see so little. I did not blame him. He had been taught. He had been taught by the master of the craft, the same man who had taught an entire town to see me as decoration. I only wondered, standing there in the steam, whether it was too late for him to learn anything else. What I did not know then was that the day would come when Daniel would have to choose what to believe. And the high shelf in my closet, where a wooden box had waited untouched for so many years, held more truth than my son had ever been willing to hear. So now you understand what I carried up the stairs that night, after the banquet, after the applause that was not for me. I carried 37 years. I carried a fortune I had set down, a son who thought I had merely helped, and a husband who had thanked a newspaper before he thanked his wife. And I carried the strange, calm certainty that something in my life had finally, quietly ended. The house was dark when I came in. Thomas was still at the hall, accepting handshakes and second helpings of his own glory, and I was grateful for the silence. I did not turn on the lamps. I went up the stairs in the dark, the way you can in a house you have lived in for decades, your feet finding each step without being told. I went into the bedroom, and I opened the closet, and I reached up to the high shelf where the cedar box had sat untouched for nearly 4 decades, gathering the dust of a marriage. It was heavier than I remembered. I had told myself all those years that it held nothing of consequence, a few worthless keepsakes from a life I had walked away from. Carrying it to the bed, I felt the lie of that in my arms. I set it down on the quilt and I sat beside it, an old woman in a good dress and aching shoes, and for a long moment I simply looked at it. My initials were still there on the lid, carved by some hand I never knew, the letters worn soft by time. E. W. Eleanor Whitmore. The girl I had been before I gave myself away. I lifted the lid. The smell came first, that warm, dry scent of cedar that had outlasted everything else, and with it came 37 years all at once. On top lay a dried flower, a sprig of something I could no longer name, pressed flat and gone to brown. I had picked it on my wedding day, I think, though the memory was so faded I could not be sure. Beneath it was a ribbon, pale blue, the kind a young woman ties in her hair when she still believes her life is hers to decorate. And beneath the ribbon was a photograph. I held it up to the faint light from the window. It was Thomas and me, young, impossibly young, standing in front of the little white church on our wedding day. He was laughing at something just out of frame. I was looking at him, not at the camera, with an expression of such complete and undefended love that I had to set the photograph face down on the quilt. I could not bear to look at her, that girl who trusted him so entirely. I wanted to reach back through all those years and warn her. I wanted to tell her to run, but she would not have listened. I know, because I was her, and no one could have told me anything that summer. These were the mementos I had remembered, the worthless little relics of a hopeful heart, and beneath them, where I had laid them so long ago, were the other papers, the yellowed originals, the proof of what Thomas had done to Walter Briggs, to the town, to the truth. My one card, never played. I lifted them out carefully and held them in my lap, these documents that could end a man, and I marveled that I had carried such a weapon for 37 years and never once been tempted to use it. That is what love does. It disarms you. It makes you keep the loaded thing in a box and forget it is loaded. I laid the yellowed papers back, and the photograph face down upon them, and the ribbon, and the dried flower, in the order they had always rested. Then I closed the lid. Whatever else had ended that night, the box was still mine, the one private place in all the world that no one else had ever touched. I returned it to its high shelf in the dark, and I told myself I would sleep, though I did not believe it. But I could not sleep, and so I did a thing I had not done in years. I went looking through my husband's study. I do not know what drew me there. Perhaps it was only that I could not lie still beside the memory of that lectern. Thomas kept a small room off the downstairs hall that he called his office, though the real work of his life had always been done at my kitchen table. His desk was a handsome, useless thing, and he kept it locked, the way men lock drawers when they wish to feel they have secrets. But I had lived with this man for 37 years, and I knew where he hid the little key, taped beneath the lip of the drawer like a boy hiding cigarettes from his mother. I had always known. I had simply never had a reason to use it. I had a reason now. Inside the bottom drawer, beneath a folder of golf scores and old correspondence, I found something that did not belong. A plain manila folder, crisp and modern, with the embossed name of a law firm in the city across the cover. A firm I did not recognize, the kind of firm a man hires when he does not want to be seen hiring anyone local. My hands had begun to tremble, and I told them to stop, and they did not listen. I lifted the folder into the lamplight and opened it. The pages inside were dense with the cold gray language of the law, but I had spent a lifetime reading documents Thomas could not be bothered to understand, and I did not need more than a moment. I saw our names, his and mine, set against each other now instead of joined. I saw a date in the corner, and I read that date twice, and then a third time, because my mind refused, at first, to accept what my eyes were telling it. It was a petition for divorce, complete, detailed, the assets already divided, the terms already set, every line of it prepared with the patient care of a man who has all the time in the world because he holds all the power, and the date in the corner, the date he had set this in motion, the date he had decided to be rid of me, was more than 6 months before he stood at that lectern and forgot to say my name. I sat very still on the edge of the bed, the divorce petition open in my lap, and I read it the way you read a death certificate for someone you did not know was sick. The moonlight was thin, but I did not turn on a lamp. Some part of me, I think, did not want to see it too clearly. Some part of me was still hoping that if the light stayed dim, the words might rearrange themselves into something I could survive. They did not. I read every page. What struck me first was not the cruelty of it. It was the care. Thomas had never in his life been a careful man. He was a man of broad gestures and easy charm, a man who left the details to others, which is to say, a man who left the details to me. For 37 years, I had been the one who read the fine print, who balanced the accounts, who remembered the dates and the deadlines and the quiet obligations that hold a life together. He did not have the patience for any of it. And yet here, in my lap, was a document of exquisite, patient detail. Every account we held was listed, every property, the house, the small pension, the modest investments I had nursed along over the decades on a public servant's salary, all of it cataloged, assessed, and divided in such a way that I would walk out of this marriage with very nearly nothing, just as I had walked out of my father's house with very nearly nothing, all those years ago. He had thought of everything. He had even, I saw, found a way to characterize my decades of unpaid work as a kind of voluntary leisure, a long and comfortable retirement at his expense, so that no court would think to grant me a share of what I had built. He had made me, on paper, exactly the woman Diane had asked about at that dinner party so many years before. A woman who did nothing all day. A woman who kept the home fires burning while the real work was done by someone else. He had taken the lie he told the world about me, and he had dressed it in legal language and made it into a weapon to be used against me. And then I reached the date again, and I made myself sit with it. 6 months. He had begun this 6 months before the banquet, which meant that for 6 months, this man had risen each morning beside me. He had eaten the breakfasts I made him. He had let me iron his shirts and choose his suits and write the very speech he would one day use to erase me in front of the whole town. For 6 months, he had kissed my cheek and called me dear and let me go on believing I was his wife, his partner, the woman who had given him everything, all the while knowing that the papers were already drawn, that my ending was already written, that he was simply waiting for the most convenient moment to be rid of me. The banquet, I understood now, had not been an oversight. It had been a beginning. He had not forgotten to thank me. He had chosen not to. It had been the first move of a man clearing a space in his life, the way you might quietly stop watering a plant you have already decided to throw out, so that when the day comes to discard it, no one will question why it had to go. He had been letting me die on the vine in full view of the town, so that when he finally produced these papers, everyone in Harrow's Bend would nod and say, "Well, of course, the poor man. Married to a woman like that. What else could he do?" I had spent the whole drive home thinking I had suffered a humiliation. I understood now that I had witnessed a strategy, and the worst of it, the part that I will carry to my grave, is that it was a good one. It was exactly the kind of patient, ruthless campaign I myself would have designed. He had learned it from me, over 37 years of watching me work. The only thing my husband had ever truly absorbed was how to take a person apart quietly. And now he had turned that one lesson on the teacher. I waited for the tears to come. I am not ashamed to tell you that I wanted them to. I wanted the ordinary grief of an ordinary betrayed wife. The sobbing, the rage, the broken glass, the long night of weeping that the body uses to wash a wound. But they did not come. Something else came instead. Something colder and clearer and far more frightening, rising up through me from the soles of my aching feet to the crown of my head. I felt myself go calm. It was not the calm of acceptance. It was the calm of a woman who has finally, after a lifetime, stopped lying to herself and finds in that honesty a terrible and welcome strength. The hope was gone. The hope had died somewhere between the lectern and that thin moonlight, and with it died the woman who had spent 37 years making herself small. And what was left, sitting on the edge of that bed with the proof of her own disposal in her lap, was someone I had not been since I was 27 years old. Someone who knew how to build a king, and who therefore knew, better than anyone alive, exactly how to bring one down. I closed the folder. I laid it back in the cedar box, on top of the yellowed papers, where the two halves of my husband's downfall could lie together and wait. And I made him a promise, the only promise I have ever broken him with. He had planned my ending. He never imagined I would write my own. Thomas came home a little after midnight. I heard his car in the drive, heard the front door, heard him moving about the kitchen, humming to himself, still warm with the glow of his triumph. I lay in our bed with my eyes closed and my breathing slow and even. The cedar box safely returned to its shelf, and when he came up the stairs and slid in beside me, I did not stir. He smelled of wine and other people's perfume, and the particular self-satisfaction of a man who has been told all evening how wonderful he is. He was asleep within minutes. He always slept easily. Thomas. It is one of the privileges of a man who has never had to lie awake doing the worrying for two. I did not sleep at all. I lay in the dark beside the stranger I had married, and I thought. The first thing I had to decide was the matter of the papers, not the divorce petition. The other ones, the yellowed originals at the bottom of the box, the proof of what Thomas had done all those years ago, lying there in the dark. I understood for the first time what a complicated weapon I held. Those papers could destroy him, but they were a blade with no handle. To wield them, I would have to admit what I had done, the part I had played in burying Walter Briggs, the lie I had helped tell the town for 30 years. If I simply marched into the light waving those documents, I would not bring down a corrupt man and walk away clean. I would bring us both down together. And Thomas, I suspected, would find a way to make sure I fell harder. He had 6 months of careful lawyering behind him. I had a guilty conscience and a box of old paper. No, the papers were not a sword to be swung wildly. They were something more delicate. They were leverage, and leverage is only useful in the hands of someone patient enough to wait for the right moment and clever enough to find a way to use it without cutting her own hand off. I did not yet know what that way would be, but I knew, lying there in the dark, that I would find it. I had found harder paths before. The second thing I had to decide was simpler, and it was this. I would not let him serve those divorce papers on his schedule. I would not stand in some lawyer's office 6 months from now, on the day he had chosen, and be handed my own disposal like a woman receiving a verdict. If this marriage was going to end, and it was, then it would end on my terms, in my time, and I would walk out the door before he ever knew I had found his secret. The element of surprise had always been my favorite tool. He had taken it from me once at that lectern. I intended to take it back. So the next morning, I rose at 5:30, the way I had risen for 37 years, and I made my husband his breakfast. I want you to understand how strange those 2 weeks were, because they were the strangest of my life. For 14 days, I became a ghost in my own home. I went through every familiar motion of the wife I had always been. I fried his eggs the way he liked them, the yolks soft, the whites crisp at the edges. I ironed his shirts and hung them in his closet by color, 5 of them, the way I always had. I asked about his day and listened to his answers. I laughed at the small jokes he made at my expense, the ones I had laughed at for decades, and he never once noticed that the laughter no longer reached my eyes, because he had stopped looking at my eyes a long time ago. That was the thing that made it possible. A man cannot read the face of a woman he has trained himself not to see. And in the spaces between those ordinary acts, I worked. I began with the records. A lifetime of managing our affairs meant I knew exactly where everything was, every account number, every deed, every policy, all the financial bones of a 37-year marriage. Thomas had drawn up his papers in secret, but he had made one mistake, the same mistake he had made for our entire life together. He had assumed I did not understand what I was looking at. While he was at the town hall, I sat at the kitchen table and I made copies, bank statements, tax returns going back years, the deed to the house, which I had paid the down payment on with the last small sum my mother had quietly sent me before she died. I documented all of it, every dollar, every asset, the whole architecture of the life we had built, the life he intended to walk away with while I walked away with nothing. I worked carefully, and I worked slowly, and I never took the originals, only copies, so that nothing would be missed. I bought a simple accordion folder at the drugstore in the next town over, where no one knew my face, paying in cash so there would be no record. And each evening, when the day's quiet work was done, I did not hide my growing file in the house, where he might one day stumble on it. I carried it out to my car under my coat, and I tucked it beneath the spare tire in the trunk, in a place a man like Thomas would never think to look, because checking a spare tire is the kind of small, invisible labor he had always left to someone else. The first night I locked that trunk and walked back into the house, I felt something I had not felt in 37 years. I felt like myself. Over those 14 days, I built my escape the way I had once built a king. Quietly, methodically, one invisible piece at a time. Money was the first true problem. For 37 years, every dollar we had passed through accounts that bore both our names. Accounts Thomas could freeze with a single phone call, the moment he understood what was happening. I could not leave with nothing. I had done that once before, walked out of one life with a single suitcase, and I had spent the next 4 decades paying for that act of faith. I would not be that trusting girl again. This time, I intended to leave with my eyes open and my feet on solid ground. So on a Tuesday, while Thomas believed I was at the grocery store, I drove 3 towns over to a small bank where the Hale name meant nothing, and I opened an account in the name of Eleanor Whitmore. It was the first time in 37 years I had written that name on anything official, and my hand did not shake at all. The young woman behind the desk processed the paperwork without a second glance, and when she handed me the temporary card and wished me a pleasant afternoon, I felt as though she had handed me a key to a door I had forgotten existed. I moved money in small amounts, the way you might bail water from a boat without letting anyone hear the splash. A little from the household budget here, a little from the grocery money there, sums small enough that they would vanish into the ordinary churn of our spending. I was not stealing. I want to be clear about that. I took only what was already half mine, and far less than I was owed. But I took it quietly, because I had learned the hard way that quiet is the only real power a forgotten woman has, and I did not intend to surrender it. I found the place I would go almost by accident. There was a town on the coast, 2 hours north, where my family had kept a summer house when I was a child, long since sold. But I remembered the feel of it, the salt air, the gray water, the way no one there had ever cared who the Whitmores were. I called a rental agency from a payphone outside the drugstore, and I arranged for a small furnished apartment above a bookshop, paid for in advance, in cash, under my own true name. The woman who owned it asked me no questions. I have noticed that the world is full of women who ask no questions, who recognize another woman in flight and simply hold the door. I have tried to be one of them ever since. And then, when the money was secured and the apartment was waiting, and the file beneath my spare tire had grown thick with the proof of everything we owned, there was nothing left to do but leave. I chose a Thursday. Thomas had a regional conference that would keep him away until late, the same kind of conference that had kept him away on the night his son was born. There was a symmetry to it that I appreciated. He had not been there for the beginning of our family. He would not be there for the end of it either. That last morning, I rose at 5:30 out of habit, and I made coffee in the quiet kitchen, and I drank it slowly, alone, watching the gray autumn light come up over the garden I had tended for 37 years. I did not cry. I had done all my weeping in the years before, in small private amounts no one ever saw, and I had none left for the house. I walked through it one last time, room by room, the way you walk through a place you know you will never see again. I touched the banister I had polished 1,000 times. I stood in the doorway of the room that had been Daniel's, and I let myself remember the small boy who had loved me before the world taught him I was not worth loving. And I forgave that boy because he had only believed what he was told. I stood in the dining room where I had hosted the dinners that built a career, and I felt no anger there, only a great and final tiredness. The house had taken everything I had. I owed it nothing more. The last thing I did was climb the stairs and take the cedar box down from its shelf. I held it for a moment in both hands. This small wooden thing that had traveled with me out of one life and was about to carry me into another. My initials on the lid, a dried flower, a ribbon, a photograph of a girl who trusted too much, and beneath them, the 2 sets of papers, the old and the new, his ruin and mine, waiting together in the dark. I tucked the box under my arm, and I went down the stairs, and I did not look back at the bedroom we had shared. I carried it out to the car and set it on the passenger seat beside me, where a companion sits. I started the engine, and then I sat for a moment in the driveway, looking at the house on its quiet street, the house where I had disappeared so slowly that no one, least of all myself, had noticed I was gone. I did not leave a note. There was nothing left to say that 37 years had not already said for me. I did not lock the front door behind me, either. I thought about it, standing there with the key in my hand, and then I decided against it. Let him come home to an open door and an empty house. Let him walk through those rooms calling a name he had not bothered to speak in public. Let him come home to the silence he created. The town on the coast was called Wren's Harbor, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, no one there knew my name. I want to tell you that those first days were frightening, that a woman of 65, alone for the first time in her adult life, lay awake at night terrified of what she had done. But that would be a lie, and I am finished with lies. The truth is that I slept. I slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a swimmer who has finally reached the shore. And I woke each morning in that small apartment above the bookshop to the cry of gulls and the smell of salt. And I made coffee for one, and I drank it slowly, and no one expected anything of me at all. It was the closest thing to peace I had felt in 37 years. I had been there 9 days when the knock came. I was not expecting anyone. No one knew where I was, or so I believed. The file beneath my spare tire was the only thread that connected me to my old life, and I had told no one of Wren's Harbor, not a soul. So when the knock came, 3 soft, deliberate raps on the door of an apartment no one should have known existed. I stood very still in the middle of the small room, and my heart, which had been so calm for 9 days, began to pound. I thought, of course, of Thomas. I thought he had found me, that the open door had not been the end of it after all. I opened the door on the chain, the way a careful woman does, and I looked through the gap, and I did not see my husband. I saw a woman. She was perhaps in her late 50s, well-dressed in the understated way of people who no longer need to prove anything, with silver hair cut short and a pair of sharp gray eyes that I knew at once, though I had not seen their like in nearly 40 years. They were Whitmore eyes. I had grown up surrounded by those eyes, in portraits and at dinner tables, the cool, assessing gaze of a family that had spent 3 generations learning to read a room before it entered. I closed the door, slid the chain free, and opened it again, and the 2 of us stood there looking at one another. 2 women with the same eyes and the same name and a lifetime of silence between us. "Eleanor," she said, and then she smiled, just slightly. "Cousin Eleanor, you are not an easy woman to find." Her name was Victoria. She was the granddaughter of my father's younger brother, which made her my first cousin once removed, though such distinctions had never mattered much in our family. What mattered was the name, and Victoria had done a great deal with hers. While I had been ironing shirts and writing speeches for a small-town mayor, Victoria Whitmore had gone into public life. She had served in the state legislature for the better part of 2 decades, and she sat now, she told me as I made her coffee with hands that had begun, at last, to steady on a committee in the state capitol with a reach far longer than anything Thomas Hale had ever dreamed of. She was, in the plainest terms, a powerful woman, the kind of powerful my father had wanted me to marry, the kind I had walked away from to follow a man with grease on his hands. I asked her how she had found me. She set down her cup and looked at me with those familiar gray eyes, and what she told me undid something in my chest that had been knotted shut for 37 years. The family had never lost track of me, not once. My father, she said, had been a hard and a proud man, too proud to ever take back the things he had said in that study. But pride and indifference are not the same thing. In the years after I left, he had quietly kept watch over me from a distance, through people I never knew were watching. He had known when Daniel was born. He had known about the lean years and the small house. And before he died, Victoria told me, he had done 2 things. He had set aside a portion of the Whitmore Trust, sealed and waiting, that had never stopped belonging to me, and he had left a wooden box on my dressing table the morning of my wedding, with my initials carved into the lid, because he could not bring himself to say the words but could not let me go with nothing. I had to sit down. After all these years, after a lifetime of believing I had been cast out with nothing, I learned that the one keepsake I had carried through it all, the box that now held both my husband's ruin and my own, had been my father's silent way of saying that he was sorry, that he loved me, that a Whitmore, whatever else she does, is never truly nothing. Victoria let me sit with that for a long moment. She was not a sentimental woman, I could see that, but she was a kind one, in the brisk and useful way of people who would rather solve a problem than weep over it. And when she judged that I had absorbed enough, she leaned forward, and her voice changed, and she became the woman from the state capitol again. I did not come all this way only to deliver an old story. "Eleanor," she said, "I came because of what your husband is about to do. There is going to be an announcement, and I think before he makes it. You had better hear what Thomas Hale is planning next. What Victoria told me that afternoon, in my small kitchen above the bookshop, was this. Thomas was not retiring at all. The banquet, the speeches, the gold watch, all of it had been theater. He was, within the month, going to announce that he was running for the open seat in the state senate. The little mayor of Harrow's Bend had decided he was ready for a larger stage, and the men who funded such ambitions, the same kind of men whose dirty work I had once helped him bury, had decided he was their candidate. I understood it all in an instant, the way you understand a chess game only after the trap has closed. The divorce papers drawn up in secret, the careful effort to make me, on paper, a woman who had done nothing, the public erasure at the banquet. It was not merely the discarding of an old wife. It was a campaign. A man cannot run for high office, dragging behind him a marriage that ended in scandal, a wife who might stand up and tell the world what she had given and what she had been given in return. Far better to reshape that wife into something harmless and sad before anyone thought to ask her a question. Far better to make the people of the district pity him for her, rather than question him about her. And so, Victoria told me gently, that is precisely what he had begun to do. In the days since I had left, while I slept my deep and peaceful sleep beside the gray water, Thomas had been busy. He had told the town a story. He had told it sorrowfully, with a catch in his voice, to anyone who would listen, which in a town like Harrow's Bend is everyone. His poor wife, he said, had not been herself for some time. Her mind had been slipping. She had grown confused, forgetful, prone to wandering. And then one day, while he was away serving the people who depended on him, she had simply vanished, walked out of their home in a state of distress, and he was beside himself with worry. He had even, Victoria said, and here her gray eyes went cold, gone so far as to suggest that the family was considering what he called options for her care. Should she be found, he was laying the groundwork to have me declared incompetent, a confused old woman who had wandered off, not a wife who had discovered the truth and chosen, with perfect clarity, to leave. I sat very still while she spoke. I had thought, after the divorce papers, that I had taken the full measure of the man. I had been wrong. There was a floor beneath the floor I had already found, and I was still falling through it. But it was the next thing she told me that truly broke my heart, and I will not pretend otherwise, because by then I had stopped pretending about everything else. He had used Daniel. My son had become the centerpiece of his father's sad performance. Thomas had wept to him, I am sure, in that warm and convincing way he had, and Daniel, who had been raised inside a story that left no room for his mother, had believed every word. Why would he not? He had been trained for 35 years to see his father as the hero and me as the sweet, limited woman in the background. Now the hero was suffering, and the background had done the suffering to him. And Daniel's whole life had taught him which side of that story to stand on. I learned the shape of it from a letter. Victoria had brought it. She had her ways of knowing things, and one of her ways had intercepted a copy of an email my son had sent. An email meant to find its way to me through old friends and family channels, an email that Thomas had almost certainly helped him write, because the cold and lawyerly phrases in it did not belong to the warm and careless boy I had raised. I read it standing at the window, with the gulls crying outside and Victoria watching me quietly from the table. "How could you do this to him?" it said. "To Dad. After everything he has done for this family, for this town. You walked out without a word and left him to face all of this alone. And now you are hiding somewhere while he worries himself sick over you. I always knew you could be cold, but I never thought you were cruel. If you have any decency left, you will come home and stop punishing him for whatever it is you imagine he has done. He does not deserve this. He has only ever loved you. He has only ever loved you." I read those 5 words 3 times, standing at that window, and each time they cut a little deeper, because they were written in my son's hand, about a man who had drawn up papers to discard me 6 months before he stood and forgot my name, my own child, the boy I had labored for alone on a snowbound February night, the boy I had taught to read at my kitchen table, had taken his father's lie and made it his own, and turned it back upon me like a blade. I did not cry, even then, but I set the letter down very carefully on the windowsill, as though it might break, and I looked out at the gray and patient water for a long time. Behind me, Victoria said nothing. She was wise enough to let the silence do its work. When at last I turned around, something in my face must have changed, because she sat up a little straighter. The grief was still there. It would be there for a long time. But underneath it, cold and clear and steady, was the thing that had been growing in me since the night I read the divorce papers by the moonlight. He had turned my own son against me, and I understood, finally and completely, that I was not going to wait for him to make the next move. Victoria stayed 3 days at Wren's Harbor, and in those 3 days, the 2 of us, 2 Whitmore women separated by 40 years of silence, became something I had not had in my entire adult life. We became allies. We worked at my small kitchen table, the same kind of table where I had once built a king, except that this time I was building nothing for a man. We spread the papers out between us, the copies I had carried beneath my spare tire, the architecture of 37 years of marriage laid bare in bank statements and deeds and tax returns. Victoria read them the way she must have read 1,000 bills in the state capitol, quickly, coldly, missing nothing. And when she had finished, she looked up at me and she said a thing that no one had said to me in 4 decades. She said, "You are not a confused old woman who wandered off. You are the most organized person I have ever met. He has no idea what he is dealing with." But there was the matter of the other papers, the yellowed ones, and I knew that if Victoria was going to help me, she had to know the whole of it, the shameful part included. So I told her. I told her about Walter Briggs, about the inflated invoices and the buried proof, about the good man whose career I had quietly ended to protect my husband, about the guilt I had carried in a cedar box for 30 years. I did not soften it. I had spent a lifetime softening things, and look where it had left me. I laid my own sin on the table beside his, and I waited for her to recoil. She did not recoil. She listened to the end And then she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, simply, "So you helped him bury a body, and now you are afraid the shovel has your fingerprints on it, too." I almost laughed. It was the most honest description of my situation anyone could have given. "That," she said, "is exactly why you cannot be the one to bring this to light. If you walk into a newspaper office waving 30-year-old documents, you are a bitter, discarded wife confessing to her own corruption, and he will bury you all over again. The story will become about you, not about him. No. The truth has to arrive from a direction he cannot trace back to you. It has to come through a door he does not know exists." This was why she had come. This was the gift the long arm of the Whitmore name could offer that I never could alone. Victoria sat on a committee in the state capitol with oversight of exactly the kind of public contracts that Thomas and his friends had abused, not only 30 years ago, but as it turned out, in the years since as well. A man does not learn honesty late in life. The small corruption I had helped hide had been the seed of larger ones, and Victoria, with her position and her resources, could open a legitimate inquiry, a real and lawful examination of public spending. That would have every reason to exist on its own, and no visible connection to a runaway wife 2 hours up the coast. My old yellowed papers would not be a weapon I swung. They would be a thread an investigator happened to pull. And once that thread was pulled, in the harsh and public light of a state inquiry, with Thomas in the middle of a Senate campaign and every eye upon him, the whole garment would begin to unravel on its own. I would not need to destroy him. I would only need to stop holding him up and let the truth do what truth does when no one is left to smother it. It was, I will admit, a thing of beauty. It was patient, and it was lawful, and it kept my own hands clean enough to survive. It was the kind of plan I might have made for Thomas in the old days, except that this time I was making it against him, and I felt no guilt at all. A woman who has read her own divorce papers by moonlight has used up her capacity for guilt. There remained only the matter of Daniel, and that was the one piece no strategy could solve. Victoria, watching me, understood. She told me, in her brisk and useful way, that I could not save my son from the truth, and that I should not try. He had chosen his father, she said, because his father had given him a comfortable lie, and I had given him only a difficult silence. When the inquiry did its work, when the hero he worshipped was revealed to be a hollow and dishonest man, Daniel would have to face it without me there to cushion the fall. It would be the hardest thing he had ever done, and it was, she said, the only thing that might ever bring him back to me, not as the boy who needed protecting, but as a man who had finally learned to see. I did not like it. Everything in me, every instinct of 35 years of motherhood, wanted to call him, to explain, to spare him. But I had spared him his whole life, and in sparing him I had taught him I was no one. So I did the hardest thing a mother can do. I left him alone to find his own way to the truth. I gave Victoria the yellowed papers before she left. She slid them into her case beside the financial records, and at the door she took my hand and held it. 2 women with the same gray eyes, and she said, "He spent 37 years making you smaller." Let us remind this entire state who the Whitmores are. Then she was gone, back to the Capitol, back to the long and lawful machinery of her power. And I stayed in my small apartment above the bookshop, by the gray and patient water, and I waited, because I had learned at last what my husband never had. The truth has a way of finding the light. A year, almost to the day, after the banquet where my name was never called, I sat on a stool in the back of a bookshop in Wren's Harbor and watched my husband announce that he was running for the state senate. The owner had the small television on behind the counter, the way she always did in the afternoons. And there he was, Thomas Hale, 68 years old now, silver-haired and handsome in a dark suit, standing at a lectern with the flags arranged behind him just so. I had arranged flags behind him just so for 37 years. I knew the exact angle. I knew which side caught the light. He spoke for 11 minutes, and I listened to every word. And somewhere in the third minute, I understood something that surprised even me. The speech was hollow. Oh, it was polished enough. Someone had clearly been paid to write it, but it had no heart in it, none of that warmth that had carried him up the hill all those years. And I realized, sitting there with my coffee going cold, that the warmth had never been his at all. It had been mine. I had poured it into every word he had ever spoken in public. And now that I was gone, there was no one left to pour it. He stood up there with all his charm and none of his soul. And the people watching could feel the difference even if they could not name it. That was the first crack. There would be many. Without me, Thomas began to make mistakes, the small kind that compound. At a fundraiser the second week, he forgot the name of a major donor's wife, a woman whose name I had reminded him of before every single event for 2 decades. The donor noticed. People always notice. At a rally, he contradicted a promise he had made in a different town the day before, because there was no one running the careful machinery anymore that kept his story straight. Allies who had trusted him for years began to feel, the way Daniel had once made me feel, that something was off, that the man they thought they knew was somehow less than they remembered. And while he stumbled in the daylight, the real thing moved in the dark. You will remember the papers, the yellow documents I had kept in safekeeping for so many years, the ones that proved how Thomas's second mayoral campaign had been built on a contract that was never honestly bid, on inflated invoices and quiet kickbacks through a firm connected to a major donor, on the ruin of a good man named Walter Briggs, whose only crime had been to stand in Thomas's way. I had carried that secret for almost 4 decades. I had carried the guilt of it too, the part I had played, the rumors I had let fall. I did not release those papers myself. Victoria had been right about that all those months ago in my small apartment. A bitter wife waving evidence that implicated her own past would be dismissed as exactly that, a bitter wife. So we had done it the other way, the patient way. Victoria, from her seat in the state legislature, had quietly requested a routine audit of decades-old municipal contracts in Harrow's Bend, the kind of dry, procedural review that no one pays attention to until it finds something. The old papers were never handed over as accusations. They were left instead as a thread for a trained investigator to pull, a thread that led from one inflated invoice to the next, from Walter Briggs's ruined hardware store all the way up the hill. It took months. These things always do. But while Thomas was forgetting donors' wives and contradicting himself in the daylight, the auditors were following that thread in the quiet. And one autumn morning, the local newspaper ran a story that asked, very politely, why a long-retired mayor's old contracts were now the subject of a state inquiry. After that, it moved quickly, the way these things do once they begin. One reporter became three. Three became a feeding frenzy. A staffer resigned, then another, each one drawing the kind of attention that resignations always draw. Donors who had pledged their support remembered, suddenly, prior commitments. The party that had been so eager to back the popular former mayor began ever so gently to put distance between itself and the growing storm. Thomas did what men like Thomas always do. He called it a witch hunt. He stood at his lectern and spoke of his enemies, of politics, of the cruelty of people who could not bear to see a good man succeed. But there was no one left to write him the words that might have made anyone believe it. He sounded exactly like what he was, a cornered man, and the people who had once felt heard by him now felt only embarrassed for him. In early December, on a gray morning with snow threatening, Thomas Hale stood before a much smaller crowd than the one he had announced to, and he read a statement suspending his campaign. He had written it himself. I could tell. It was clumsy and self-pitying, and it blamed everyone but the man reading it. I watched it on the bookshop television, and I waited to feel triumphant. I had earned triumph. Surely. He had planned my ending in a folder 6 months before he ever needed it, and now I had watched his own ending arrive instead. But I did not feel triumphant. I felt something quieter and harder to name. I felt the weight I had carried for 37 years finally lift from my shoulders, and in its place there was only a vast and settled stillness. The man I had built had unbuilt himself the moment I stopped holding him up. I had not destroyed him. I had simply stopped being the foundation. And a house with no foundation does only one thing. He had everything, and then slowly, and then all at once, he had nothing. In the weeks while his father's world came apart, my son disappeared from view. I heard nothing from Daniel, not a letter, not a call, and I did not reach out to him. It was the hardest restraint I have ever practiced. Everything in me wanted to go to him, to stand between my child and the terrible thing he was learning. But I had promised myself I would not spare him this. He had been spared his whole life, and being spared had nearly cost him his soul. So I stayed in Wren's Harbor by the gray water, and I let my son fall through the floor I had once held up for him. I have pieced together since what those weeks were like for him. He had built his entire life on a single certainty, that his father was a great man and his mother a small one. Now the newspapers he read each morning were dismantling that certainty piece by piece. The hero he had defended to my face, the man he had written that cruel letter to protect, was being revealed in plain and lawful daylight as a liar and a cheat, and worse, Far worse for a boy like Daniel. He began to hear from the old people of Harrow's Bend who had no reason to lie anymore. Another story entirely. He began to hear who had really written those famous speeches, who had really won those early elections, who had sat at the kitchen table until 3 a.m. while his father slept. An old woman named Mrs. Delaney told him. I learned later that his mother had once been a Whitmore, and that the whole town had known it, and that Thomas Hale would have died a mechanic if Eleanor had not made him a king. Daniel had not known. He had genuinely not known. The story he was raised inside had been so complete that he had never once questioned the woman in the background, never wondered why his quiet mother seemed to know every powerful family in 3 counties, never asked himself how a small-town mechanic had risen so impossibly far. The truth had been all around him his entire life, and he had been taught not to see it, exactly as I had been taught not to see my own erasure. It is a terrible thing to watch the foundations of your life give way. I knew that better than anyone. And so when the knock finally came, on a cold evening just before Christmas, I think I had known it was coming for days. I opened the door, and my son was standing there. He looked dreadful. He had lost weight. There were shadows under his eyes, and the easy confidence I had always resented just a little was simply gone, scoured away, and what stood in its place was a man who had finally seen the truth and did not know how to carry it. He had driven the 2 hours up the coast without calling. He stood on my threshold in the cold, this grown man who was once a small boy I taught to read, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. Then he opened his mouth, and his voice broke, and he said, I read the letter I sent you. I kept a copy. I read it again last week, and I could not believe I had written it. I could not believe the things I said to you. I did not speak. I had waited 35 years. I could wait a moment more. He told me everything then, standing in my doorway because I think he did not feel he had the right to come inside. He told me about Mrs. Delaney and the speeches and the slow horror of understanding. He told me he had gone back through his whole childhood in his mind and seen it all again with new eyes. Every school play his father missed, and I attended. Every fever I sat up through. Every quiet sacrifice he had been taught to read as smallness, when it had, in fact, been the largest kind of love there is. He told me he had believed his father because believing his father was easy, and believing in me would have required him to see how badly we had both failed me. He said he was sorry. He said it again and again, the word coming apart in his mouth, and it was not the careful, lawyerly sorrow of that letter. It was the raw and broken grief of a man apologizing to his mother. And I will tell you what I did, because it is the truest thing I know about being a parent. I did not make him stand in his guilt. I had spent my life being made to feel small, and I would not do that to my own child, not even the child who had wounded me. Not even when a part of me felt he had earned a moment of it. I reached out and I took his cold face in my 2 hands. the same hands that had held him on a snowbound February night. And I told him that I forgave him, not because what he had done did not matter. It mattered. But because I was his mother, and forgiveness was the one thing his father had never had the courage to give anyone. And I was not going to raise my son inside that poverty for one moment longer, even now, even grown. He broke then, this grown man, this defender of a fallen king, put his face against my shoulder in the cold doorway of a small apartment above a bookshop, and he wept like the boy he had once been. I held him. The gulls were quiet. The gray water was still. And after a long time, in a voice muffled against my shoulder, thick with tears, he said the one word I had stopped letting myself hope for, the word he had not given me in years, not since he was small enough to need me without shame. He called me Mom. 1 year later, almost to the day, the town of Harrow's Bend held another banquet. The maples had turned the same furious red. The community hall glowed with the same candlelight. But this time, there was a different name on the invitation, printed at the very center, in the place of honor. This time, the name was mine. It came about through Victoria, of course, and through the old people of the town who had begun, once the truth came out, to remember things they had let themselves forget. They remembered who had really steadied Harrow's Bend when the mills closed. They remembered the quiet woman who had known everyone's troubles and everyone's children's names. The town that had watched me disappear had decided, in its slow and belated way, that it owed me something it could never fully repay. And so they did the thing that small towns do. They held a dinner. They called it a recognition of decades of service to the community. And they sent me an invitation with my name upon it. My real name, the name I had taken back at the county clerk's office on a bright morning in spring. Eleanor Whitmore. I almost did not go. There is a part of a woman who has been forgotten that learns to distrust applause. But Daniel asked me to. My son drove down to Wren's Harbor to ask me in person, because he did not want to do it over a telephone. And he said, "Mom, let them say your name out loud. You have waited long enough." So I went. I will not pretend it healed everything. The wounds of 37 years do not close in an evening, however kind the words. But I will tell you that when I walked into that hall, on my son's arm, in a deep burgundy dress I had chosen entirely for myself, the whole room rose to its feet. And when the master of ceremonies read my name, Eleanor Whitmore, into the warm and crowded air, I did not wait in vain for it. It came. It arrived. After a lifetime of waiting at the end of a long table for a name that was never called, I finally heard my own, spoken aloud, in a room full of people who had at last understood what I was worth. Thomas was not there. He had left Harrow's Bend by then, gone to live quietly somewhere south where his name meant nothing, which was, in the end, the only fitting punishment. I do not hate him any more. Hatred is a weight, and I have set down enough weight in this life. I simply do not think of him very often, and that, I have learned, is the truest freedom there is. I keep the cedar box on a shelf in my apartment above the bookshop, where I can see it from my chair by the window. The papers are gone from it now. The yellowed proof did its quiet work and is no longer needed. The divorce, when it finally came on my terms and left me with my fair share at last. The box holds only the old things now: a dried flower, a pale ribbon, a photograph of a girl on her wedding day who loved too much and trusted too easily, and whom I have finally learned to forgive, and I keep it where I can see it, not as a wound, but as a reminder. My father could not say the words, so he left me a box. It turned out to be the truest thing anyone ever gave me, because inside it, all along, was proof that I was never nothing. I had simply forgotten how to read it. If you have stayed with me to the end of this story, I want to leave you with the one thing I know now that I wish I had known at 27, standing in my father's study, and at 40, washing the good china in the dark, and at 65, waiting at the end of that long table for a name that would not come. Your worth was never theirs to give. It was never something to be granted by a husband's gratitude, or a child's recognition, or a town's applause. It was yours from the beginning, carried quietly inside you through all the years you spent making yourself smaller so that someone else could feel large. And it is not too late. It is never too late. Not at 65. Not at 75. Not at any age the world tells you that your story is finished. I walked away from the life I knew when I was old enough to be called foolish for it, and I found, on the far side of that fear, the one thing I had given away so long ago that I had forgotten it was missing. I found myself. If this story touched something in you, if you saw in Eleanor a piece of your own life, or your mother's, or someone you love, then take a moment now and let her know she was heard. Like this video, so that more women who need to hear it will find their way to it. Share it with someone who has spent too long waiting for her name to be called. And tell me in the comments below the moment in this story that stayed with you, because I read every one of them. And behind every comment is a woman who deserves to be seen. And if you believe, as I have come so dearly to believe, that it is never too late to reclaim the life that was always yours, then subscribe and follow along, so you never miss a story of the courage it takes to begin again. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. For 37 years, the world forgot it. I will never let it be forgotten again. And neither, my dear friend, should you ever let them forget yours.